very lucky now to have Sean Ordain from Wellington City Council talk to us about digital twin technology. So over to Namuta to introduce Sean.
Tēnā koutou everyone. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sean Ordain, who's had many roles at Wellington City Council, including the Strategic Planning Manager and the City's Innovation Lead. He's responsible for leading urban planning and city insights at Wellington City Council, and he's presented at quite a few conferences nationally recently, but also he's done a lot of work and got a lot of connections internationally as well. He's on the Open Government Partnership Expert Advisory Panel, the Digital Twin Task Force, the World Economic Forum's G20 Smart Cities Advisory Group, and the Global Futures Council. Sean's also been recognised for a number of international awards, including a Harvard Global Innovator Award in 2020 and Smart Cities Council Leadership in 2020 as well. So over to you, Sean. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm very sorry I couldn't come up and see you all today. But you'll be aware that the political weather in Wellington is almost as rough as our wind, so probably best I stay here. Anyway, I'm an urban planner, but a fairly unusual one. I deal with the digital side of the profession. And so that is, how do we measure things? How do we understand things? How do we communicate things? And one of the reasons I do this is because I don't know if you've read many district plans, but they're not the most engaging documents, but they're so important for the future of our cities. And this is one of the ways we use to make them more understandable for people, so that when they're making their submissions and when the councillors are making their decisions, they become more real for people. So one of the things to bear in mind is between planning and technology, there's a lot of buzzwords. And what they have in common is the way we engage with the future. And what's really interesting is the future is often around us already. It's just we haven't quite seen it. And so one of the things that's really fascinating is that if you look at the history of Nintendo, the patenting of the fax machine, and Queen Victoria, they were all around at about the same time. And they all happened pretty much within about 2 years of each other, which it's fair to say there weren't too many Victorians trying to work out how to use a fax machine, but it's similar to the way we view things like AI and GIS and some of these other technologies today. There are often people in our organizations using these things. They just haven't quite become common knowledge. But one of the things which you'll find in your role as governors of your region, same as I do in service of the city, is that everything is joined together somehow. And that's one of the key things we do when we're using our digital twins and we're using our systems to measure things. It's to understand how those joins happen so that when we pull on things, we can understand what else will move. The way I explain it to my classes is, if I was to tie every single thing in the room I'm in together, and then I pulled on a string, I could probably anticipate my glass of water moving. I probably wouldn't see the picture that would come flying off the wall and hit me in the head. And that's basically what we're trying to do, is trying to reduce the number of times we get hit in the head. One of the other important things is those strings form patterns. And just like in our city, you would have seen the same things happening in your region where those patterns are changing. So we have things like sea level rise and seismic slumping to deal with. So seismic slumping is what happens after earthquakes when the ground begins to recede. We also have changes in weather. So I know that we were very focused on the cyclone responses in the east and north of the country not long ago. But we have to remember just the year before there were water crises. And so this is where those patterns become important, because this understanding how that pendulum swings means that you plan for both. You plan for too much water and also too little. But also it means understanding how things change at a very micro level. So one of my favorite projects that is done in partnership with our council is looking at tree species and how those tree species set seed. And so we have Otari Wilton's Bush just up the road from us. It's the country's largest native botanic garden. And what we're looking at there is how does natural selection work under different climatic conditions? Because understanding the health of the forests is essential to understanding the stability of our hillsides, because those trees do more than just process air. They also hold things together and reduce the need for building expensive retaining walls. And so understanding how these different traits are selected becomes vitally important to us over time. But also, we've been doing this for a fair while. So in 2011, we first put our district plan into 3 dimensions and projected it onto the buildings. And back then, we were worried about earthquake-prone buildings and how were we going to identify the opportunities for strengthening and which ones are going to be demolished. And then a few years' time, we built with the National Library a model of Wellington that, as it was in 1840, as it was in 2015, and then we got some architectural students to show us what it might look like in the future. We set it up in the National Library. You could fly around and see how your house had changed and how it might change in the future. Get people used to the idea that things haven't been the way they are for all time. And in 2016, we had I think it was 2016, we had the Kaikoura earthquake, and we used our sensor systems and those 3-dimensional models to manage the city. It's one of the reasons why Central Wellington wasn't cordoned off the way Central Christchurch was. It's because we could look in 3D at what was happening at the time, respond to it, and also understand where things like cordons would go, and be able to calculate things like fault zones and the impacts on different infrastructures. Probably the most interesting data set was one we used to contact the business owners that had been affected by the earthquake. What we did is we drew down all the FPOS expenditure before 11 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. And anywhere that expenditure had dropped, we isolated food and drink, which in Wellington was largely coffee at that time of the morning. And we used that to understand where coffee consumption had dropped. And that's where we prioritized inspections and contacting of business owners so that we could offer what help we could. In 2017, we put everything into VR, and we used that to help plan what our longer term rebuild would look like for some of the buildings we lost, but also to resurrect the streams flowing beneath our streets. And then if you look forward to today, we're using it to design playgrounds. We're understanding with a high degree of realism what our streets and what our buildings look like and how they can change. And it's helping me as an urban planner, because instead of giving people sunshade diagrams of how a new building might shade, we can just put them in here and play with the sun. It's a lot easier. But behind these technologies are also some really interesting use cases. So this is what AI looks like as it thinks. And so this is a system called TensorFlow. And each one of those dots is the sound of a bird from a network of microphones up in Zealandia. And what we're doing is using a form of regression analysis. So we're listening and then classifying it statistically. And what they're doing is telling us which type of bird we heard. Have we heard a kakariki? Have we heard a tui? There's 9 different species that can be counted this way. And what it's doing is answering a really simple question for our councillors. We pour money into Zealandia at one end and birds pour out the other. How is our funding helping? Is our funding working? And we can tell you it is. What it has led to is a number of bird species that were locally extinct, things like the kaka that hadn't been seen in many, many years, returning to the city. And now I'm in the position with my own children of teaching them the names of birds that I never saw as a child. So it's been a learning experience for everybody. The other thing we do is then in our planning systems, we use those high definition maps of the city to understand, for example, where all the trees are. So this is a map of every tree in Wellington. Everyone needs a hobby. This is mine. We do it programmatically, so I don't have to count each one. But what this does is it helps me understand our planning rules and the work that's being done by our communities to plant trees, to see that we end up with corridors that are joined up so that we can restore more habitat. It also helps us through our long-term plan isolate which parts of the city are missing trees so that we can target funding into places like the central city, which are fairly grey, to connect these corridors up. And then that become part of the city's brand. So The Guardian and a number of newspapers around the world have written stories about how Wellington's restored its native indigenous bird life. And it's a reason why people come and see us now. One of the other things we've been doing, and we're launching this on Friday in our library system in the east of the city, is understanding how things like climate change and natural hazards interact and what they mean for climate adaptation decisions in the future. And so what we've been doing is working with our iwi partners to resurrect the city as it was in 1460. And so understanding when Miramar was an island, what that environment looked like, what it looked like further on when Miramar had become a peninsula and it had lakes in the middle of it, and understanding how different parasites related to that landscape, and then bringing it forward to the present day and into the future to show how, based on the science that we have, what could that mean for the future and how would our relationship look? And by putting it into the context of that long history, we can start to see what happened over several generations, what might happen in another several generations. And so this allows people to interact with hazards advice and look at different adaptation options as a community, and that will underpin the community adaptation pathways, which are being worked on next year. And then that will go forward into our spatial plan, where I will draw up all of that investment and that before the councils to inform the next infrastructure strategy and the next long-term plan. And essentially that gives both the community the information that's always been available to them, but in a much more interactive form, much more understandable form, but also helps them understand what the role of the council is, how the financial decisions get made, and then whose financial decision is it? Because there's many impacts from this kind of work that aren't for the council, but as a community, it's not going to work if those other partners don't play their role. And so what we've also been doing is rebuilding our streets digitally, and this is helping us simulate how they will look with new investments and new layouts, and checking that things will actually fit, particularly the turning circles of buses. Quite fascinating when you do it digitally. And to help that, we've also been understanding how pedestrians move around the city. So what we've been doing is deploying these sensors through the city that allow us to understand motion pathways and also the different modes that people are moving around in. Now, there's several reasons this is important. One is because we fund transport, it's quite a big portion of our budget, but also because it's a vital data set for retailers. And one of the interesting things with working for a council is you don't necessarily get to hear from retailers directly all that often. If you think about it, the ratepayers are normally the landlords. There are some retailers we hear from quite regularly because they require some sort of license from the city. But otherwise, our work essentially relies on submissions, whereas by having data that's freely available that people are interested in, that can create some of those more casual conversations and help us understand some of those future needs. The other important thing behind this is how the ethics are applied. So you can't undertake these, particularly these types of sensing operations, without incredibly robust ethical frameworks. And so privacy isn't a compliance exercise, it's a direct design driver. Because as a council officer, I'm not interested in who walked down the street, I'm interested that somebody walked down the street. I need to know the numbers and where the crossings should be. I don't necessarily need to know, well, I don't need to know who it is. So it's important that principles like data minimization, anonymity are applied from the beginning. And if you want some good guidance on that, the G20 have some excellent guidance on privacy architecture from experts around the world, and also our own Privacy Commissioner. Really quite brilliant if you go to them proactively. And so all of this has informed our new district plan. So this is, most of the zoning went through in March, and the final piece will go through in March next year. And so what this plan has done is introduce new ways of dealing with hazards. It's also more than quadrupled the development capacity of the city. And it's also introduced stronger protections for things like green spaces. So all of this was relied on those evidence bases, and by being able to show the commissioners in 3 dimensions what we've been doing, it helps refine some of those quite wordy descriptions you'll find in things like regional policy statements and plans into something that's a bit more easy to digest and to understand how a building will resolve from it. And lastly, my favourite particular project. Sorry, everyone's got their favourite that gets inflicted on everybody they speak to. But this is the Wellington Underground Asset Map. So we've been working with city councils around the country to map what is beneath the ground and figure out a way of making that information available to the people designing and contracting and working in our streets. And it came from a realization that we had maps showing where things should be under the ground, but it's been quite some decades since anybody had actually seen what was under there. And it turned out the maps of where things should be were not where things are. And part of that realization came during the Taranaki Street project with that chap driving the digger. Took the kids down to look at the digger, and they were scraping, he was scraping the ground. And I said, oh, that's a funny way to dig. He said, oh, I'm feeling for the gas pipes. They were supposed to be in the trench on the other side of the road I dug, but they weren't there. So if I feel a bump, I'll know I've got one. And at that point, I decided the kids could probably play somewhere else. And that really does underline the difficulty we've got, is how do you invest with certainty and efficiency and safety in an environment where you're not quite sure what's down there. And so what we've been doing is working with cities across the country and around the world as well to create a way of verifying what's under there, making that information available so it can be reused from project to project, and then reforming the corridor access request system, which is the system that contractors that wish to work in the street use to make that more efficient, much more effective, and to try and minimize the disruption that occurs to road users and the retailers that line our streets. So we've launched it as a beta now, so it's being used for real in the city streets. And essentially what we're finding is just how valuable this data is in reducing our contingencies, but also helping change the way we design things and consent things. Probably the interesting piece for somebody looking at digital twins is more the architecture of it. So although it's a digital project, it's also an infrastructure project. And so there are 6 key work streams. The policy and processes are how we adapt the corridor access requests and the regulations to require digital information and to make the system work. Number 2 is a technology platform, so somewhere to put the information. Number 3 is the internal change and alignment. So how do our staff change? What sort of upskilling is required? How do we upskill our partners and the people working in the streets to make sure we haven't created a toy for them? It's actually a really useful tool. The sector support is to prevent the rail gauge problem, where every province in New Zealand had a different rail gauge, became a real problem until nationalisation. And so what that is all the standards and adoption models, so that as councils engage in the same thing, we don't end up with this incompatible systems. And then number 6 is quite interesting. It's a value add. So that's the how does data get shared? Because there's lots of stuff that you can do with this data that isn't really of interest to local governments, but it is interesting to businesses and to contractors. And so that's making sure that the data is held, licensed, and provided in a way that can build an economy. And as a public servant, I don't build businesses, but I do have a role in helping build an economy. And so what you end up with over time is a much more accurate and accessible way of understanding the data, and a way that also tells you the certainty of it. So when was it last seen? You can look at the photographs, you can use the scans, you can see how the infrastructure overlays each other. And it's helping us move from this idea of just a two-dimensional street where you drive on the surface of it to a three-dimensional public space where you can understand all of the different functions it's providing. And this data gets shared across the city for lots of different uses. It's being used up in Tawa by the local school and the community board to build their own models. So those orange things are from their last submissions to council, where the Tawa College had drafted an NCEA technology standard to use this data. My staff helped teach some of the technical skills, and then the community board provided their input to the district plan back using these models, which helped councillors understand what they were talking about a lot more effectively than sort of pointing at a map or long written descriptions. They've helped us commission new libraries and new pools, and we managed to help assuage some of our staff concerns about how different lunchrooms would be shared between librarians and swimming pool staff that hadn't come up before. And so what we're finding is, as the data gets reused and reused, we get more and more value from it. But behind everything we do, these principles, basically, we must have a clear purpose. We must be able to be trustworthy and also trust. And we also have to be able to function effectively. Now, these are taken from the Gemini principles, which are used internationally. They're first used in Britain. And the main things that we do that are a little different from overseas jurisdiction is we design in the Te Tiriti partnership and the democratic roles of elected representatives from the beginning of projects. Then if you look at where we're facing into now, our big challenges are RMA reform and working out how we can get some efficiency from that by investing digitally. We've been doing trials with rules as code, which is where you encode regulation directly into a machine executable form. So it helps you automate and audit processes. And so that's quite an exciting potential for how we do resource consents. Resilience is always a problem. There's the reurbanization problem. So we are intensifying our city, but we're intensifying on a relatively brittle infrastructure skeleton. And so huge amounts of work is being done to basically figure out how we can build new infrastructure underneath the streets to sustain it. You would have seen some of the challenges we've got with water, but there's similar challenges with things like electricity and the other utilities as well. And then there's the tech and us challenge. One of the big issues is our relationship to technology continues to evolve, and it's also not universal. So understanding the concerns of communities and when technological solutions are not suitable, or understanding ideas of Indigenous data sovereignty, or where, frankly, everybody needs to learn and we need to figure out how to learn alongside them as well, is one of those core strategic priorities for us. But I thought I'd just finish with this. This is my favorite thing down in the National Archives. It's a map created by Tupaia. Tupaia was on the Endeavour when he called in on Bay of Plenty. And this is a map he made. It's a fascinating map because it was made by Tupaia using all of the latest European technology of the time on board of the Endeavour. And it's taken us about 200 years to figure out how to read it. But it typifies the type of approach we're looking to do for New Zealand. What we need to do is figure out how to use the latest technology in the world, but in a way that works for us as New Zealanders and helps us fulfill the potential that our country has. But I think that's enough from me. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Sean. I think you've just about blown my tiny little brain there. So I'll open it up to councillors for questions. Councillor White.
Kia ora, Sean. Thank you for that. It's really fascinating, and your work with the iwi would be fascinating insights. You know, you're in a way, you know, in the time when our people were here, had mobility. They could move. They didn't anchor themselves, so they could actually work with nature, go to and back, to and fro. One of the issues that's always intrigued me is that when nature takes its course, and in Wellington, for example, you know, you have exposure to some massive faults and some massive geological issues there. And the Wellington fault takes front of mind for me. I worked down there with DSIR and a number of others. At the time, I was an engineering geologist and did a lot of the mapping work down in Wellington area. And the last time that particular earthquake happened was about 1,300 years ago, and it has a habit of moving every 1,500 years. And so the consequence of what I'm saying here is it's good to plan for the now and for the future as we see it. Does your digital process, and can it, and I'm assuming it can, actually look at the digital elements of nature's changes, of a major earthquake, in which case for Wellington, now that you've got Transition Gully, you've got another exit point. But before that, you had no exit point other than up the Paikakariki road. So there's things like that. And over here, we have sea level rise, we've got potential, we've got geothermal activity, eruptions and things like that. Another interesting element for me is, and I know it would scare the bejesus out of people if you started to look at this, but nevertheless, you know, it's preparing for a number of nature consequences or natural consequences that could really impact a society that can no longer easily move and be mobile and to seek protection and then move back after the fact has happened. So do you have and I know Tupaya's map, and I'm familiar with Tupaya's work with on the Endeavour, and prior to that, Kupe's work as well, as they mapped in different ways and they looked at nature and how nature manifested itself and then prepared their map and their strategies around that. So do you have a comment to make? I know I'm sort of circling a little bit here, but I'm really wanted to extend a sense of that digital mapping and planning to one of safety of communities in future, so that we can mobilize ahead of or have plans for that particular consequence. Not should it happen, in my view, when it will happen. So do you have a response, Sean? Sorry for the rather long question and comment.
So as a planner, there's two concepts which sit behind how I respond to that question. One is the understanding of risk. So for certain risks, they are so catastrophic that you can't really plan for it. The eruption of Lake Taupo would be a good example. It's so impactful and so sudden that you're very much left with the situation of how am I going to pick up afterwards? Let's see if we survive to do that. Where this technology can be useful is in simulation. So understanding what an event looks like. So a really interesting thing we did with Te Papa was we modeled seishing. So seishing's like tsunamis, it's where things slosh backwards and forwards in the harbour. It's incredibly destructive because a tsunami sort of goes and comes out a couple of times, whereas seishing can continue for days and it'll destroy everything on the shoreline. But when we simulated it so that the emergency managers could actually see it and see the water moving through buildings that they recognized, it changed the way that they understood the hazard, and it made it much more real for them, which then changed their approach to planning. The other piece which is quite useful in some of that simulation is understanding where the particular escalation and trigger points are. And so, like all cities, we have emergency management plans, quite detailed ones. But built into those plans are particular pieces of information that will be required after the event. And so they're effectively reconnaissance plans for how do we get it. So a critical one, for example, is the resurvey of the harbour. You're quite right. We live at the end of a mountain range that plunges into the sea, and we cannot assure land access. So we will need to relieve the city by sea. And so that means being able to make sure that the harbour depth hasn't changed. And so what we do is we look at our plans, but into those plans, we also build how are we going to generate the choices for our children or the emergency managers of the day to get the information they're going to need to take a path. Because ultimately, you can defy nature for a while, but you will bend to it in the end.
Wow. And a question from Councillor Nees.
Thank you, Sean. That was absolutely fascinating, and it was wonderful to see the power of technology, which is enabling, some really good planning outcomes. My question is about your potential use of AI as a tool that can actually perhaps extend the predictive power of the systems that you've got in place. Have you got a comment on how you are or how you foresee AI will be able to help your work in the future?
Yes, so we've dealt quite a bit with machine learning. So one of the key things to understanding AI is artificial intelligence is a philosophical idea. So you can achieve artificial intelligence when a machine simulates intelligence. It's the sort of Turing test. You talk to it and you no longer realize it's a machine. The technologies that underlie it are things like large language models and machine learning algorithms. And if we look at the potential for AI with, particularly in local government, there's enormous potential in the optimization of patterns. And so that's looking at how things like traffic lights work, or understanding how nutrients flow through a system. And that sort of AI is not really the language-based stuff. It's doing things like basically processing. So things that you would normally get an army of people to do, you can then essentially automate. The piece where it becomes interesting is in the large language models, because at that point you're interacting more with the democratic system and the people-based system. So I think the key questions for us are not just how do we get consent to do that, but how do we maintain consent? Generally, systems are really good at asking you, are you okay with this? They're not very good at asking, are you still okay with this? The other interesting ethical piece is in how democracy itself works. So we've been having discussions about the use of things like ChatGPT and the use of submissions. And there's quite a wide range of opinions on it. Some people think it's cheating. Some people think it's unethical. I tend to think that it can actually be quite useful, because if it makes somebody more articulate or makes up for something that wouldn't mean that they're not taken as seriously as another person would be in writing, then actually it's a really good thing, and that restores a degree of equity. Where it becomes interesting is how, if you were then to feed those algorithmic submissions into an algorithmic processor. So as a council, you started to process in that way. At a point, the machines talk to the machines. And as an elected representative, how does that help you make a decision? And so that's where the ethical side comes in. And one of the key things that I think we should all keep in mind is we're not really here to become a smart city. What we're trying to do is become an informed democracy. So as an elected representative, how does the use of these technologies help your community inform you of their concerns and what to do about it? And at what point does it become a screen or a barrier? Probably the last point I'd make is on consent. So we talked about people giving their consent to operate. The challenge that AI can give is in making sure that that consent is understood into the decision-making process, and that the AI is acting on that person's behalf in their best interests. And ultimately that comes down to the input data, in my view. One of the challenges with AI is it is just an advanced form of pattern. It's mathematics. You need to make sure the data that it's being trained from is correct, because if you train it from poor data, you might be able to simulate a good outcome, but that will be an accident.
Thank you. That's terrifying. Thank you.
Sean, I have a question, and it kind of is linked to your comments to Councillor Nees's question, but it's around behaviour change, so predicted behaviour change. So, for example, I'll take the topic of mode shift as a desired behaviour change. So it's not necessarily what people are doing now, it's what we want them to be doing. And the planning and the predicted behaviour change outcomes in terms of degree of certainty, and then obviously the interface with democratic ethics, because for example, let's just take pedestrianising a part of Wellington City, where there'll be two camps. One really want the cars to remain coming down that street, and the other camp really want it pedestrianised, cycle, walk, etc. And so people have a democratic right to say which of those they want, or somewhere in the middle. And then, but if we're wanting to decarbonise, we're wanting a mode shift transition. So how does all of that fit into this model?
So the difficulty with prediction is it assumes we know what's happening now. And so that's one of the reasons for investing in all of those pedestrian counters, is to get a good idea of how different modes are actually functioning now before we look to predict. The other important democratic consideration is you can delegate agency, but you can't delegate responsibility. And one of the more interesting ethical problems in a democracy is where elected representatives could essentially point at the AI and say, but it told me to do it. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because ultimately you can't delegate your responsibility to other people. And where some of these technologies can help is in setting your goals for mode shift. It can help you understand, are you achieving them? It can also help statistically predict whether the actions you are looking to take based on much larger data sets than can be manually processed are likely to work and give you a probability. But ultimately, one of the most challenging parts of your job is you need to look into the future and say, let's go over there. And at a certain point, that's leadership. The technology can help you with the evidence base to give you confidence to go, let's go over there. But it can't take the responsibility. It also can't necessarily deal with the challenge that you're creating, because ultimately you're trying to change a pattern. And a thing that works off patterns can't necessarily predict a change in pattern. We see that.
Yeah. Wow. This is fascinating. I think I need a week with you to bombard you with questions. So any other questions from councillors for Sean? Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, Sean. We really, really appreciate that. And we've recorded this and we'll be putting it up on our website for others to enjoy listening to what you have to say. So thanks very much.
Excellent. And thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
So, Chair, just on the back of that, looking at Fiona in particular, Also what aspects of this are we picking up potentially as we renew our systems?
So in terms of the digital technology and digital twin technology in particular, we already have that as a part of our GIS team. So we are currently looking at a project or a series of projects where we'd be able to utilise this, which are already, the projects would need to be already built into our long-term plan. So we're just doing that review at the moment to see which specific ones that we could test and trial things on. So work in progress, of course, also our AI working group across our organisation. We've developed an AI plan with particular focus areas too, which I'm happy to be able to provide an update to councillors on. Certainly it does provide, we've got AI guidelines as part of that in terms of how our organisation interacts with AI. So I'm happy to provide an update on our AI plan and those key focus areas that we've got built in currently as part of our long-term plan. We are about to trial a Copilot, which is a Microsoft functionality system, which we're interested to see the outcome of that pilot. But we certainly do see the key opportunities in terms of the increased processing, which Sean talked about. So, yep, happy to report back on that.
You also mentioned in the science field, is there an opportunity there?
When we're looking for the project, we are looking across all functions, including science. We're looking for some quick wins, so we'll let you know how that goes. Yeah.
It's a question for you, Ngā Mota, based on what you've said. Do you see this having implications for our RPS, this digital planning and the information that comes out of that?
Absolutely. I think we're always thinking about more efficient and effective ways to deliver things as we move forward, particularly as we look to what a joint regional plan might look like. AI and increasing technology always helps with automating processes and making things more usable. What we need to make sure is that any use of that is done in a way which maintains the privacy element to it as well. But certainly in terms of our plans and processes, I do see AI as a key opportunity into the future.
I guess my question is based around giving more weighting to the RPS. As you know, we all know the impact that is sometimes it's not a given when the TLAs are considering the RPS. And I guess my question is about the research that's been given. Will it give the RPS that weighting that I feel, and maybe others around this table often feel that the RPS is not given the weighting that it should?
We haven't considered that specific factor. When I was thinking about plans, I was thinking more about the development and use of plans in terms of submissions into plans and how we might automate the summary of submission process. So we haven't quite gone to that next step in thinking that further.
That's a really good point in terms of also for engagement. So things like Project Future Proof, the Whakatane, if you could simulate the risks without that wall, how people can see. Yeah.
Perhaps just to add, the key priority and focus areas for our AI plan, our organisational AI plan, are around AI leadership, empowering our kaimahi, creating a safe space to experiment and learn, providing clear communications, and building up our AI infrastructure. You heard Sean saying the importance of information going in and data going in. So we're just looking at how we make sure that our data and information is in the right format to be able to be more usable. So we've established an AI leadership oversight group. We're assessing our organisation in terms of AI readiness. We've developed a communications plan. We're providing AI training for our on selected areas like Copilot I mentioned before. We're evaluating AI tools. I mentioned the safe experimentation place, and we're also just determining what we need to enable this to happen more.
Where are we at in terms of cooperation, coordination with other TLAs or agencies in general, actually, when I think about it? Are we, because duplication is the enemy of productivity, and also sometimes a project can be piggybacked onto something else one way or the other.
Yep, absolutely. We've been linking with all of the councils. We've had many requests to see our guidelines. We've also linked in with the regional sector as well in terms of different councils' approaches to AI. You've got the different approaches going across the spectrum. You've got the no, don't want to hear about it. I'm working hard here, to the early adopters. So certainly we have a lot of people are looking to our AI guidelines as a good starting point, and I'm happy to share those as well.
Because I can imagine, over there, I guess this morning, for instance, they'd be interested in some of the things we do, Kaingawara. So there's agencies even beyond. So you can go bigger than Ben-Hur, but those agencies impact actually on what we do. So it'd be really important just to sort of cast your eyes beyond local government.
So just in terms of process, so the updates that you give Namuta, will that come to strategy and policy, or will it go to monitoring ops in terms of technology, reporting back and updates? What's the best?
I'll probably need to just connect a bit and then look back to you in terms of the best way of communicating. I'll do that through the weekly email.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so let's move on, councillors. So we're on to our item with the review of the council community funding. So welcome, Graham.
Councillors, so this is a follow-on session from your previous session held in early October, where you looked at the Māori, the MIF and the co-governance funding, as well as gave us some guidance on the integration of our policies. And this workshop is particularly to look over the review of those selected policies. This was an action that came out of your long-term plan. You asked us to specifically review the 4 policies, and we're here today to reflect on those learnings and the recommendations that came out of that review. So I'll hand over to Graham. We also have some support staff as well to help support in the conversation, both here in person as well as online, depending on where your questions may go. Over to you, Graham.
Tēnā koutou, councillors. And yes, then, as Namuta has mentioned, we've got the review of community funding here. We have prepared a presentation which basically mirrors the paper that has been provided, and attached to that paper that you received, there was the larger report that looked at the review of the various funds. So if councillors are comfortable, suggest just work through the presentation, which includes the recommendations out of the review as well.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So just to recap, what we're really keen to get councillor guidance on today is, first of all, the reviews of the various funds, so the Community Initiatives Fund, Volunteers, Environmental Enhancement and Māori Initiatives Funds, and also just touch on a couple of aspects of the integrated management of community funding. So across those 2 areas, there are 14 recommendations in total, and yeah, so we'll just plan to work through those. Whoops. Just a quick recap. A number of councillors would have seen this from the presentation on the 3rd of October as well. So just a reminder around some of the rationale for why we do provide community funding. And we do that through a number of our different activities, and it does look at adding significant added value towards achieving council outcomes, including through the additional mahi which is provided through the community groups and organisations that we support. And along those same lines, we looked at a number of the grant funds that council does operate, and that's really looking at those 9 funds which I've identified. The ones in green are the ones which are the subject of this review, but just noting that there are a number of other funds that do that council operates as well. Sort of the approach we've taken through the review is we've focused on those 4 funds, but where there have been logical intersections with the other funds, we have looked at those as well. And this might be a little bit small to see on screen. It is in the agenda pack. I think it's page 57. It's essentially mapping our various funds to our community outcomes. Each of these funds do have very distinct purposes, but this is a way of showing which funds are supporting which outcomes. So this is the current state leading into this review. Brief touch on that review methodology. So just some of the key aspects that we were looking at there. And again, just noting that we sort of followed where the review led in terms of any other funds outside of those four that were the focus of the review. Those are the four funds in particular. Just about to move into the actual recommendations out of the review. Any thoughts, comments at this point, or?
Councillor Crosby?
Thanks, Ram. I didn't realise that sustainable development doesn't have a bucket.
In terms of our community grant funds in that way, I suppose, so the SIF, for example, can contribute in that space, but there will be other funding that council provides in other areas that do contribute to that outcome. So you look at examples, we haven't included infrastructure funding. So if you looked at perhaps the funding to Rotorua Museum, for example, that might be linking into that space in some ways. And other work that is done across council supports that outcome. So one thing we looked at with the funding allocation models is...
Sorry, Jane.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind before you move on, the freshwater implementation funding, I don't think we've talked about that. So is this within somebody's operational budget, and how much is it, and what's the process for that?
Kia ora, Councillor Nees, it's Namuta here. So just in terms of the freshwater implementation funding, so as part of the LTP, council set aside funding over consecutive years for the implementation of the new policy. So that's 400,000 this financial year, 800,000 the following years. And there was a range of different activities that funding could go towards, which ranges from support for land management opportunities, support for tangata whenua engagements, and the bolt-on actions that we were looking at implementing as part of the policy. We are currently reviewing that budget in light of recent council decisions and looking at where we might gain efficiencies given the direction we are going at the moment. Yeah.
So as part of that funding, are we providing funds to community groups or to iwi groups, or is it all internal funds?
Some of the funding is external this financial year. There is some funding which has been set aside for tangata whenua. So I would need to come back in terms of the exact amount and the contracts that have been that we've entered into.
Well, it's just a case in point. My whole issue is about trying to get an integrated picture of where our money is going to support the community. And to find that we've got a bucket like that we haven't got visibility of is a bit concerning. So I just think perhaps we consider when we do the reporting that we ensure that we pull in all of the funds that we're providing out to support community groups and others, because otherwise we're never going to get a full picture of the investment we're actually making in communities. Thank you.
Just looking at the funds that we operate at the moment, it really fits into two categories. We've got contestable funding around, and then we have on application funding, and there's pros and cons to each type of fund. One thing with our contestable funding around, those decision mechanisms in the current state do apply in a couple of different forums. RSO, the Regional Safety Rescue Services Fund, for example, is a little bit of a mixture of the Civil Defence Emergency Management Joint Committee together with Council via the LTP, the Māori Initiatives Fund, the Heara Tautoara Contestable Fund is currently sitting with staff allocation decisions, and then we have a range of typically the smaller on application funds where staff make decisions on those. So one thing that we were looking at when we're looking at these funds overall was potential to shift the contestable funding around allocation decisions to one point, so that that all those funding decisions can be looked at through one meeting outside of the LTP process, and that would look at a number of benefits we feel in terms of improve council visibility of the funding and where that funding is going. Also, from the community's point of view, it does provide some increased transparency and a more integrated approach to how we're operating those funds. And reflecting back on the recent LTP process, that would also provide councillors and staff a greater opportunity to prepare for those funding rounds and provide information, respond to questions, etc.
Just in line with that, I see under cons there, I know you're probably trying to find a con, but that's, in my mind, it's actually a pro, because it makes sure that we have some discipline around our processes. So not being able to willy-nilly increase budgets, I think, is a good thing. So that should be on the column.
Are we going to discuss those now or when we come to the recommendations?
Well, are you going to move on to the first couple of recommendations in regards to these points?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can do. There was one more slide, but I can skip past that.
Yeah, happy for you to move on, and then when we get to the recommendations, then we'll yeah, thanks. Take probably two or three at a time, won't we? Because there's so many of them. Yeah.
Exactly. I just put this one up as a sort of an example of the RSRSF fund, where we've got a process which there are reasons for it, of course, but it does go through a slightly longer process. Moving to this one approach where council makes those decisions would simplify it and make it much more efficient and provide that direct oversight by councillors. And this was the first three recommendations around this. So first of all, we'd be looking at shift the funding allocation decisions from LTP and plan deliberations to a separate council meeting. So that's the first part of it, and that impacts the SIF and potentially VIF. And then two other recommendations to consider around shifting other fund allocations into that process.
Perhaps just to remind councillors that we anticipate following this workshop that we will bring this information back to a future Strategy and Policy Committee meeting to update and confirm by decision. These are the recommendations from the report. Given it's a workshop, we're seeking your direction.
I support, in principle, those recommendations. I was always a bit puzzled with the RSRSF, how it went to emergency management, came back, and I had some problems with that, Graham. But I also have some problems where, not just there, but where we, with the best will in the world, stick some funding allocations out to other groups, which we're actually accountable and responsible for. And effectively, they'll make a decision because it's pretty hard to overturn that. And it can happen in public transport. It can happen at the regional land transport. It happens all over the place where, the buck stops with us. And I do appreciate engagement with certain sectors, but we have to be careful that, to be frank, they don't do the decision making because they're not responsible or accountable. We are around this table. So just how we get that balance right is important. So I think taking out, one one step in the process which you're proposing to do, particularly around the rescue stuff, I absolutely support. And I think, you know, from Jane's point, trying to get visibility over this, if it comes back here in one day where we see it all and we can understand the consequences, where the allocation is going, is there equity and all that, etc. I think it's a good idea, you know, just to put it all here, all in one day. The other issue, Graham, is, and it's an LTP problem really, is we need to make sure that if we're going to go down this track, that we do understand inflation adjustment, etc. Otherwise, it builds up over, say, 5 years or maybe two LTP terms, 6 years. And all of a sudden, you know, there's a massive shortfall. So we make a big step rather than just small incremental steps, if that's the right thing to do, because that has an impact, obviously, on the rates, you know, when you make these big jumps. So I'd prefer to have updated information about, is this still the right thing to do? If so, is it inflation adjusted or appropriately adjusted with some other metric to make sure, one, it's actually creating the value we want it to create.
Ken?
Oh, similar. I strongly support recommendation 1. I think it's more transparent, it's simpler, and more accountable. I think the arguments are very clear, and I think recommendation 1 is having it all in one session with the transparency and the optics of that would be a lot simpler and streamlined.
Yeah,
Okay.
kia ora, Madam Chair. I support exactly what Ken and Stuart are saying. I like consistency across the board, where everything is on the table and nothing is separated out. Then we have an opportunity to really have a good sort of global look at what we've got and make our decisions accordingly together. No, I support recommendation 1.
And 2 and 3, they're kind of all linked. It's not 1 or 2 or 3. They're a bunch on the same theme. Yeah.
Might be useful to know.
Yeah. Is anyone not happy with the gist of these recommendations?
I guess my question was revolves around what Jane has said, and that I understand that today we're dealing with the funds that are sitting in front of us, but how do we address what Jane has raised to get a broader picture of what funding is actually distributed to the community? Because what has been raised with the freshwater funding availability doesn't fit within this gambit. But I think it is necessary for us to have that knowledge as well, because having this knowledge determines, even in our LTP process, how we allocate funding if we're increasing funding moving forward. But I think without having the knowledge of funding that's also being held by staff, I think will impact on the bigger picture that we should be looking at. And I'm not saying that you take away that authority from staff. What I am saying, though, that should be part of the picture that is given to us as what funding is provided by this council to the community, so that that is also taken into consideration when we're making the decision around who is awarded the allocation of this funding.
Absolutely. So my key takeout from the discussion so far is that councillors would like to see all the funding together in that time when we go through the funding and the funding allocations specifically. So we need to bring you the full picture, is what I heard. Yep.
And I think there's also, which comes up later, a recommendation that this comes through monitoring and ops, so that we get our eyeballs on it through. That's right, isn't it? That, like, the reporting of all of this.
It would be really useful if we provide you with a table in terms of why you made decisions in your long-term plan and in terms of what you funded. So, for example, these funds are really to enable the community to achieve outcomes in their own right. So a lot of this funding is that there are incredibly good ideas in the community and they want to achieve outcomes. And so you support the achievement of community outcomes. The Freshwater Improvement Program Fund had two key outcomes. One was to enable you to get good policy decisions being made. So it was to get input to enable more effective engagement or consultation in terms of your decisions in terms of freshwater progressing. You also, though, in many areas, incentivise change. So this council has a habit of incentivising change and then following up with rules. And so that's what's happening also in terms of your freshwater outcome. So they're very, very different purposes for the funding. The funds that you have in front of you are funds that are available to any entity in mainly the ones we're talking about on this slide, contestable processes, where they're seeking to achieve outcomes in their own right that support the regional council outcomes. So what we can go through in terms of where you've allocated funding in the long-term plan and say, you know, the purpose of this funding was to enable you to consider what the community thought in terms of enabling you to do freshwater policy, for example, which was the fund that was talked about before. But they're very different purposes.
Fiona.
Thanks, Fiona. I think you might have answered a question that I was sort of cogitating on, and you phrased it well for me, because I was thinking if we've got a contract to, you know, ABC Drainage Limited, then we're not expecting that to come here. So what's the difference if the outcome we wanted was for ABC Incorporated Society? And it's not who owns it, but the outcome and who defines the outcome and who expects and what the consequence of not achieving the outcome is, because it's a contract for service effectively. So the funds where we are saying, you've come with a good idea, you think you can do this, we don't know how you're going to do it, but you've got your volunteers and so on, go away and do it, and then come back to us and say you've done it. And there might be, and something to talk about later on, is what is the consequence of not achieving something you tried to do, and whether we treat it as a pilot and a good try, or whether we treat it much more contractually, I think is a question we need to get to. Thanks.
Councillor Nees.
Oh, thank you. I accept there might be different outcomes, but I still think we need to get the integrated picture. For example, I do think it's important for us to know where all our EPs are and where the money has been spent during the year in doing riparian planting on private property, for example. We're getting environmental outcomes out of that, but it's still money flowing out from this organisation into the hands of people in the community. And we do need to get a picture of where that money is being spent, how much is being spent, and how it's allocated. So the ones that we're looking at today are a certain sort of outcomes, but I do believe that when we get our reporting, we need to be able to see the funding of private entities as well to improve water or outcomes in land management. So I hope Fiona's comments aren't given to us to say, well, we're not going to get the reporting on that, because I do believe we've got a responsibility to see where our money is being spent. And if it's being spent within the organisation, we can see that through the financial reporting. But there's a lot of money that we spend that is spent outside in the community, and I think we need to get that full picture.
Absolutely, and we've been thinking about this in terms of how to improve our reporting, because we are reporting, but it's sliced a different way. So, for example, through risk assurance, we report every year in terms of all the money that's gone out to consultants and contractors. And you get the full list. The EEF funding is reported in annual reports on EEF. The funding on, say, focus catchments is reported in terms of specific focus catchment reports. So we're just trying to look at how we can improve that so that by place in particular, you can get a comprehensive report of all funding from the regional council into that catchment or place. So slice it a different way, because you're getting it separately to different committees, and it's clearly not meeting the mark in terms of the integration that you're wanting. So we've gone away and thought about that in terms of how we can present it a different way. And so we certainly are thinking about that.
I suppose in terms of our strategic PO, some of this funding crosses over more than one, so that wouldn't be, because in my mind, I'd think, okay, you know, what's the strategic direction? What are the key strategic goals? Okay, what are we spending in each of those and what's the outcome? But because some of the funds bridge 2 or 3, you can't really do it like that either, can you?
You're absolutely right. In terms of in the past, your outcomes we could report almost by outcome, but this time they are so interconnected. And so it's a different way of reporting, because even though on page 55 is the diagram that Graham was talking about, you can't really tag it just to one PO or outcome, even though we've tried to simplify it as much as possible.
Councillor Shirley.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, Fiona's intervention very helpful in terms of clarifying, and this is not really the contestable fund, but on the implementation of the fresh water regime, we're in this transition phase. We were gearing up and resourcing up for what was a very heavy regulatory regime and very prescriptive, which the government's now said, tai-ho, woe. We must have allowed a lot of money to support that very implementation, that very heavy prescriptive, every farm virtually, farm plan for fresh water. I haven't seen, it seems inevitably now we're moving to a much lighter, simplified regime. We don't know the full details of it yet, but there must be, like we had accreditors, auditors, certifiers, huge responsibilities from regional councils in that implementation. What's the savings there? Where's that money in those budgets? And there'll be a bit of community funding, but I take your point, it sort of transcends both. But there must be a very large dollar of resource, financial, staff resource, that will now not be required to the same extent that it would have been under a heavy regulatory regime. So what I'm really asking is, what's the optics? So where is that resource? Where is that money? What's the numbers on it?
Yes, so multiple answers to that. This council in the past has not put in funding for things that haven't been legislatively in place or they don't think will happen. So we didn't have funding in for certifiers and auditors because you were waiting for that to actually become legislatively required. Having said that, in your long-term plan, you took $1.6 million out of policy and planning because of preempting what would happen with this government. So you were very clear in terms of where you're wanting efficiencies and effectiveness. When you have your next annual plan workshop, we've looked at that again in terms of suggesting further savings that can be made. And so that will come to your next annual plan workshop in that space. But you don't front load the budget for what has not been put in legislation, and you proactively withdrew money out of the long-term plan based on change that was highly likely to happen. And there's funding to come out again because of recent government direction. So that will come to you at your annual plan workshop.
Thanks, Graham.
Perfect. So just moving through into the individual funds. So Community Initiatives Fund, I'm sure councillors are quite familiar with this fund, seeing as how the decisions were made recently through the LTP. This is just a bit of a historical view of the funding and funding allocations here. This fund is typically oversubscribed many times. And so just that view, there is, yeah. So it's quite a broad-based fund looking at projects that support council community outcomes across all 5 outcomes. With this particular fund, the recommendations we have is, first of all, just that one we've already addressed, shift that funding through to a combined meeting. Secondly, is when we're looking at the wider group of funds, there is the Te Hapaiora Regional Outcomes Fund, which also, it is specific to supporting events, and it's a very small level of funding, I think $2,000 per grant, but it does also apply across all 5 community outcomes. So we were thinking makes sense just to integrate the 2 policies into one, create very small efficiency gains, but it would reduce the number of policies we have, and it's just a recommendation that we came through this review.
Does that make sense to everyone? Everyone comfortable? Yep.
Next, we had a look at the Volunteers Initiatives Fund. So this fund was established through the 2021 LTP, and really it's had two focuses in that. One has been supporting the capability and capacity of volunteer groups, and secondly, there's been funding for projects that have a very strong element of volunteerism in the delivery of the projects as well. You may recall through the more recent LTP deliberations that there was looking at these funds SIF and VIF together almost, and so where we've come to with this fund is this recommendation that because there is that overlapping in some ways of the 2 funds, our recommendation is essentially to disestablish the Volunteers Initiative Fund and move the funding that is for projects or programs that use environmental volunteers to the SIF, so just combine that aspect, and then retain the funding to support the capability and capacity of volunteer groups within the catchments activity, which is where the VIF funding sits at the moment. So then it would just be funding which is used by the activity to support the capability and capacity of the environmental volunteering.
Makes sense to everyone? Yep.
Just about that. If you just establish the volunteer fund, so BCA is I know that they're an umbrella organisation, but and it will be managed, you're suggesting it be managed through the catchments activity, but it will still be a grant to a community group. So how do we get a say into how much money BCA is provided if it's going to be within the catchments activity? Because I'd be concerned that, staff have got a tight budget, and so they decide, oh, well, we won't continue funding BCA. I do think we still need to have visibility and some ability to ensure that there's sort of parity, that they continue to be funded at the level that's relative to their contribution.
So just a couple of points I'd note in relation to that is, first of all, the BCA funding agreement does last through until the end of this LTP, and that funding is still tagged to supporting the capability and capacity of volunteers. Through any LTP process, there is an opportunity for councils to review and adjust budgets, and so that budget allocation if it was to change, would be through that LTP process, and then based on the funding available, it would be still tasked to that purpose.
So basically that will come to us it's locked in for 3 years, and every 3 years we'll deliberate on whether that gets increased or whatever.
The amount of funding would form part of that activity budget and is tasked at the moment. So I would, based on our historically what we've done, then yes, it is proposed that it would be managed within the budget. So the individual contracts relating to that spend wouldn't necessarily come to council unless council is particularly interested in that.
No, see, I have a bit of a problem with that. I'm quite happy for it to be decided in an LTP and then be committed for management by the catchment activity. But I wouldn't, because they do such incredible work, and they are a volunteer organisation and a very strong enabler within the community. I wouldn't like us not to have some input into the amount of money that they're provided. So I'm concerned about us not having a say and being given the ability to ensure that they are getting the ongoing funding that we think is warranted. So I just wouldn't like it to be buried within the catchments activity budget, and we don't have any visibility of that.
So through the chair, the budget would be determined through the LTP. We can work on a way to make the information more visible by way of a regular report. I'm looking at you, Chris, or another mechanism to be able to do that. So we can take that offline and work through how to make that information more visible as we go through the process.
This might tie into the one of the later recommendations about how the reporting on achieving what the grants are for is managed, and the later recommendations, it all comes to one. This one would have to be picked out though, because it's been removed from one of the funds. So while you're talking about it, that might be the solution, but to make sure that even if it goes through the sort of the internal budget process, it still gets reported in that bunch. Yeah.
Absolutely, that's an option.
Just a question as well, which is a hypothetical one. So if BCA wanted to do a standalone project or, something outside of their core business, would they still be eligible to apply in one of these other fundings, for something like cadet program or whatever? I'm just making this up, but are they exempt or are they immune from being allowed to apply for anything else because they're captured here, even if they had a separate project innovation or something?
So no, they wouldn't be. So if an organisation has a separate project which is delivering something different to what's under the original agreement, but aligns with another fund, for example, then they're welcome to apply under that other fund.
Cool, thank you. Any other questions on this slide, these two recommendations before we move on? Cool.
Just in terms of the Māori Initiatives Fund, so councillors have seen that a few times recently, and recently adopted the policy at the meeting on the 23rd. Because of it being a new fund and being developed, we did not look at it in depth, merely in terms of whether to try and ensure consistency with this fund, with the recommendations through this report. So the key thing there is really around what is being recommended is transferring the decision making for the larger MIF grants to council from staff, retaining the small kaitiaki grants with staff decisions.
It's Terry.
Again, I'm happy with this. I'm supportive of consistency, bringing it into the one circle. We can all look at it with everything else. I'm supportive.
Any other comments? No.
Moving through into the Environmental Enhancement Fund. So this is a fund which has been around for a long time. It's looking back, it was around about 2000 when it was originally established, and it's taken a few different forms over the years. And it's really looking at providing funding for practical on-the-ground projects that look to enhance the environment or improve and protect the natural historical features of the region. The projects typically have a strong focus around environmental outcomes, including biodiversity in particular at the moment, and supporting community access to the environment. It's a fund which the funding levels have remained pretty or constant over the last 5+ years. And the level of funding requests does vary. So we had, for example, a very quiet period through COVID, as you'd imagine, and a backlog of applications coming out of that. Then we've had, we did have less applications and funding allocated last year. However, this year it's, I think, close to 200,000 now of applications received in 4 months into the year. So it's one where that does vary. Looking through when we were carrying out the review, we had a few recommendations which we're proposing around the Environmental Enhancement Fund. So first of all, looking against the new strategic direction and community outcomes that were set out through the LTP 2024. So I think there's a good opportunity to extend the purpose and eligibility criteria to move more to also align with supporting resilience and adapting to climate change. That does also provide, in some ways, a potential next step of funding for one of the other funds that's operated, which is the Climate Change Adaptation Planning Fund, which just provides funding for planning to help organisations plan to adapt to climate change, whereas this would provide potentially an opportunity to help implement some of the outputs of that funding.
Denise?
Oh, thank you. Yes, I agree in extending the purpose and eligibility criteria for the EEF. So just for clarity, it would still be, people could still apply for the things they apply for now, but if they were doing some climate resilience work, they could also apply for that?
Yes, that's correct. And looking back over the 20 years, which was quite educational, I must say, the EEF has refined its focus at various points, depending on what council's priorities and outcomes were at the time. So this is effectively reflecting that here. But short answer, yes.
Yeah. So just one thing. I've had comments from people about the ability to apply to the EEF for interpretation signage. Is that currently included in the criteria? If not, can it be added in? Because a lot of people, they do a project, but then they would like to tell the community about it and have some sort of sign.
If it is part of a project and it's a key part to delivering on that project, then I'd expect that, yes, it could be considered. But if it was just a sign on its own, I think would question how is that project enhancing the environment under the current regulations. So if it's part of it, if it's part of a project and that signage is instrumental to delivering on the success of that project, then it could be considered under the current criteria.
Well, it's
for example,
recommendation 11 talks about education focused projects, and I think that the education is in could also be justified, that the signage and interpretation is educating the wider community. So I'd actually like staff to think about whether or not that should be included in the EEF fund. If it's
Councillor
not
Scott.
linked to a project, if that they've applied for funding to do a project, but say that they've got a wetland and they think it would be really great for people to be aware of who did it and you know, why it is important to look after the environment. I'd actually argue that that's actually worth funding.
We can certainly look at that, yes, yep.
Yeah, with regard to recommendation 11, the devil is in the detail there. So in terms of wayfinding, in terms of information signage and so on, I tend to agree with, you know, it's part of our project. But being able to report back, this is what we achieved in our education program, it becomes very that can only be very vague, because how can you measure whether or not someone passing by learned anything? So I'd be, just as a recommendation, if we're going ahead with that, to be really clear about what is the expected outcome of an educational project, because it can just grow like topsy.
Great.
Rhona?
I just think I wanted to, you know, if what's being raised around the education thing is probably more in line with community initiatives fund, and not necessarily the environment enhancement fund, but I can see the connection. But I guess it's going back really to the purpose of the fund. And I guess it's going to be a judgment call on you guys who help the applicants through of where the fit is better done.
Yep.
Support Madam Rhino on this. The EEF fund is a fantastic fund, and that is really action orientated, and I don't think it's I think signage is part of a project, because you have to sell your story if you want to get volunteers to help you for the next part. I declare a conflict of interest in that I'm a trustee treasurer that is right in the process of getting, we've been granted, that haven't paid us yet. But I am a recipient, and I think this is one of the most fantastic funds, and we better be careful that we don't overburden the fund with more criteria, so that because we normally, you know, the 300,000, we put it up from 250 to 300. There's so many good projects that we want to encourage people to actually get things done, get plants in the ground, get the pest control done. So we don't want to water this fund down. That's the only reservation about bringing other things into it. So just caution is all I'm saying on that, so that, because it's got a very good success rate with.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree that, you know, if it's a training where, for example, you know, young people are taught trapping or planting or whatever, but if it's just a vague education slant, it could take away from, as Councillor von Daddelson says, plants in the ground and action, you know, gumboots on. And so, yeah, I think we're all on the same page with that in terms of caution around what is education, and how do you prove the outcome of an education project?
So could I take,
Sorry, just, yeah.
Going to move on to the next recommendation, but if you've got something to say about.
I was just going to suggest, so if we retain that focus, that the project is deliver those on the ground benefits, and if there's a side benefit around environmental education, that's okay, sort of thing. So, but the focus remains on that practical aspect. So
That makes a lot of sense. Councillor Nees, did you still have your hand up or?
Oh, no, sorry. I
Oh,
forgot to
okay.
do it. Thank you.
Thanks.
So yeah, just moving on to recommendation 12. Look, this is the bane of applicants for funds, and I hope that as a result of this this is about the process of applying. I hope that you've looked really carefully about, even in the larger funds, if the information you ask for actually gets used. Because if it's not being used, all you're doing is really putting a load on volunteers who've got, from our point of view, better things to be doing than filling in applications. So can you reassure me that all the information that gets asked in the longer form is information that's required and goes towards making a good decision?
Absolutely.
yes. So yeah, particularly through the assessment of the projects. So we'll be looking at all of the information to form, and our processes typically will receive the application, we'll work with the applicant to make sure it's complete. We will ask a subject matter expert, who's typically for a lot of projects going to be a land management officer, to have a really good look to make sure that they feel that that project, based on all the information received, is going to deliver what is stated. And we will often, based on that feedback, suggest the applicant make some tweaks and changes to that project to enhance the benefits of it as well.
Awesome. We're doing well, Graham.
Okay. So that was the focus on the 4 funds. We did have a focus also just around the integrated management of community funding in a wider sense. And councillors looked at and endorsed those common fund design operation principles at the 3rd of October meeting. We did just want to talk a little bit around the 2 others, and the last one is what we've already discussed in a fair bit of detail. So just around progressing work to enhance the customer user experience here. So we do have at the moment all the information on the funds and the application forms, etc., on our website, and we have a guide which you may be aware of, where we collect information not just on our funds but on other councils, other regional funders, and provide that to the community. TCC has our guide on their website, for example, but we do feel there's some opportunities to provide a more integrated approach in terms of our comms and engagement and promotion of our funds, and just making sure we have that clear, consistent messaging across them all. Progressively looking to align all of the application forms so they have the same look and feel and those sorts of usability type aspects, and looking at the funding application process to make sure it is working for the customer as well. Sorry.
So if someone's fund applied this year, do they have to re-enter all that stuff next year? Or if they've applied for one fund, do they have to re-enter it? Or is your systems a bit more integrated? Or was that be the plan?
So within the funds themselves, certainly we'll look at retaining information, like there'll be information around the pay details and those sorts of things. We'll also, of course, have a history of who's been funded in the past, but we will go through and check these things because, contacts change, addresses change, apart from a GST number, and pretty much anything can change. So, yeah.
Just a question around match funding, for example, with the school sustainability fund, the other funders came in and said, well, we like what you're doing, we're going to chuck some money in the pot as well for this awesome fund. How open are these others, for example, the EEF? So if you've got someone like Bay Trust who say, wow, that's getting some amazing outcomes, we want to partner with you. How much is that sort of sought after, or what does that landscape look like?
So there have been a number of discussions through that group around around opportunities to co-fund or to match fund. And the School Sustainable was a really good example that came through that forum. And there was a little bit of case, I suspect, of a couple of the funders came on board, and then that spread across to others wanting to be involved as well. And it doesn't necessarily, the conversations aren't necessarily restricted to these types of funds. It can be for some of the other conversations around other projects or work that council is doing as well. In relation to the Environmental Enhancement Fund, haven't had any direct conversations around providing co-funding for that. We do have, the last couple of years, we have had enough funding to meet the demand, but it's certainly something we can explore with them. There have been conversations around that group potentially establishing a smaller sustainability type fund with a bunch of different funders going in. And you may be aware that a number of the councils in Tech Bay Trust contribute to a larger events fund, so that those conversations do happen. Yep.
Yeah.
So the recommendations out of that part were effectively just around developing that overarching engagement plan, comms engagement plan for the funding programs, and that work to standardise application forms, etc.
So can I ask, is that the second point there, the integrated grants management system, is that Smarty Grants that you're going to be looking at? Because that's used by most of the entities, like T-System use it, Tech uses it. Is that the one that you'll be looking at?
I would stress as explore looking at a integrated grants management system. That is one of the options. There are also other considerations internal, including existing tools that council may have available as well. But yes, we've had conversations with other funders. Western Bay, for example, use it, plus I think Tech does as well. Yeah, so Smarty Grants in particular. Yeah.
Councillor Scott?
I'm just wondering why you're recommending, because it sounds very business as usually to me. So are there some implications of this? Is it budgetary or resource, or is this?
At the moment, there's no budgetary implications. I think that's probably that explore the dedicated grant system. So if we did end up coming to point of recommending an external system which has a cost to it, that would be something we'd need to consider. But we're just flagging that we are aware that a number of organisations, councils and otherwise have a external system or an integrated system that seems to work very well from the customer side of view. We will need to look at that before we could say whether it's something we'd support. And then the last area around accountability and reporting. So this content actually is in the actual report itself, and I think was shared at the 3rd of October meeting, but I think we've probably discussed a number of aspects around this already, but essentially the proposal is to look at bringing a more comprehensive integrated report back to council. We've suggested monitoring and ops because that's where we feel would be the logical place for this to sit.
Yeah, and I suppose that connects to the conversation that we were having earlier about bringing it all in because it's a bit scattered. Yeah.
And so those are recommendations out of that. So
any questions around this, councillors? We've got a thumbs up from Councillor Nees.
Okay, I think that was the so the next steps we've just got, we'll look at finalising that report which was attached to the agenda today and bring that to S&P for confirmation, and then we will look at preparing updated policies on these various funds, which was part of the original request for direction through LTP, and then move forward with implementing the work.
Thank you, Graham, and thanks to you and staff for all of this work, because I think I can really see all the threads being pulled in and everything being streamlined as to councillors' requests, and I think it's been a fair bit of work, fair to say, but I think it's getting us into a really good place. So I look forward to this coming to the council meeting and being adopted. So thank you. Any other questions? Cool.
Councillor Millen, do you just want me to quickly summarise the key actions and takeaways?
Yeah,
from
that'd be
today?
great.
So initially, there was quite a bit of support for bringing all of those applications together and deciding those which have council delegation across them together to look at them in one place. We noted that we were going to look at how we improve our reporting by place. That's an action that we'll take away. Fiona also mentioned that we can bring a table of the LTP decisions and the rationale behind them, if that would be useful. You asked us to consider in that joint reporting to monitoring and ops, adding to that the funding from the VIF that was shifting to the catchment activity. So that was the 180K, making sure that that was reported as part of those other funds. There was a discussion around ETH and the decision to keep the criteria as it is to projects when it comes to signage and wayfinding, that projects that have that as a component would be fine, but not dedicated.
Sorry, it wasn't quite keep it as it is, because I think there was agreement to the broadening to the climate resilience bit.
Yeah,
that I think councillors were comfortable with that. It was just the education,
the education signage. Keeping the rest of it as it was, not extending it out. There was support for the forms being streamlined and making sure that any information we ask for, particularly in that larger form request, that we do use that information. And there was a discussion around ensuring the conversations with the joint funders, in particular how we get ongoing alignment and any additional funding for sustainability projects. And then the note around looking at external systems, in particular Smarty grants. I think that's the wording I got down.
Just with alignment with other funders, I wouldn't want the message to be that that's the direction that we actively want to go in at the expense of having independence about making decisions, because what I've seen happen in some occasions is, TECT was quite common, because we'd made a decision on the condition that you got funding from such and such. Actually, we put the other funders into a bind. And now that I'm on the other side of the fence, I wouldn't want to be so committed to those sort of arrangements that we lose all independence.
So maybe not alignment with funding, but looking at additional opportunities as we've done in the past to when we've got projects and great systems and processes in place that others can come in and also add funding to. So just clarifying that point. Thank you. Hopefully I captured all of that.
Just a question, just going back to the EEF, I agree with we need to be careful about the education provision, but I do want to make sure that if somebody puts in an application that for a project that does include as well as the action on the ground, but does include some interpretation signage, that will still be able to be funded. I wouldn't like signage to be taken out completely.
Yep, absolutely. That was really clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we'll review the wording to ensure that we make that clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Fantastic. So thank you, Graham. Thank you, staff at the back as well. And thanks to Namuta and Fiona and Chris. So that brings this workshop to a close.